Well, it's actually quite straightforward. So it's a geolocative mapping tool, which means that women can really specifically locate experiences that they're having in cities. And this is very different to the way that we presently gather data, which might be around postcodes or larger regions of the city. So this is really drilling down and talking about, as you say, safe and unsafe experiences. And we're getting really, really accurate data around these particular
Well, the
experiences.
interesting thing, of course, is that Melbourne keeps being nominated as the most livable city in the world by The Economist and other publications, yet safety for women is still an issue. So, what sort of trends have emerged from the data you've been gathering?
Well, I think, it's really interesting because I think that, safer cities and livable cities is really interesting only because it's only looking through one particular lens and we're not using the lens of women to think about how we perceive cities. So the kind of trends that we're seeing in the research that we're doing is around particular typologies of spaces. So things like public transport spaces are particularly unsafe, and of course sexual harassment on the street is enormous. And this isn't just around Melbourne, it's lots of cities that we've been surveying across the world internationally.
And that's something, again, that I can refer to my own experience as a woman. When I was living in Sydney, there was a pub at the end of my street, and I basically would take a detour every evening after 6 p.m. because I just inherently knew that it would be unsafe to walk past. And these are sort of strategies that we as women, regardless, as you say, of where we live, we all employ, don't we?
What you're describing is something fascinating, and this is the ways that women are excluding themselves from entire areas of cities. And this is what the map has been able to capture, is that there's a geography that women internalise of places in the cities where they just won't go, or they take extreme care, or they never go alone. And this is really important to help us understand how to plan better and make cities safer.
And that then begs the question, what do you do in order to make a city a safer place for women?
Yeah. Well, I think that, my background is as an architect and urban researcher. And so people assume that it's going to be particular kinds of buildings or material things in cities. But actually, what we're starting to do with our collaborators is to really think very carefully about how we communicate expectations of behaviours, how we think about how we don't only look for forensically for the ways that we might describe or understand women's safety. So at the moment, for example, safety cameras are everywhere in cities, but these are only useful after something really terrible has happened. So we're trying to think about preventative measures that we can use to help women.
Can you just expand a little bit further about some sort of preventative measures that have been found to be successful?
So in the UK, for example, and with regard to public transport spaces, the police in the UK developed a whole communication campaign, so posters around expectations of behaviour on public transport and the unacceptability of sexual harassment and what to do if you were sexually harassed. And this both increased reporting of sexual harassment, but then in the long term, it decreased the sexual harassment occurring on public transport. And it's not simple, but it is quite simply a communication campaign and following up on women's reporting. So I think that's a great example.
And another thing that keeps coming up in conversations we have as women is lighting.
Of course, yeah.
And so, what can be done in terms of town planning and in terms of ensuring that we do feel safe at night?
So we've collaborated with Arup engineers and they actually analysed all of the really bad hotspots in Melbourne, and they discovered that actually these really overlit spaces, these are really unsafe for women. And so there's a very...
That's really interesting.
Yep.
Why?
So, well, because I always say that overlit spaces feel like a horror film, and you would know this, that very bright white light doesn't make women feel safe at all. And the Arup people have been able to identify a range of lux level that is able to really make women feel safe. But it's also about being able to read faces and to not have areas of blackout when you're walking through large cities' spaces. So it's actually really careful and very nuanced, and this is going to change policy in Australia.
Are there any cities anywhere around the world that are getting it right?
So the case study that I always refer to is Vienna. And in Vienna, they've had over 20 years of gender mainstreaming, which is where we think about cities through the lens of all genders. And Eva Kale has been a champion of that project. She's an urban planner, and it's quite simply about lighting, as we've just talked about. It's also about access and making sure that all forms of ability and disability can access areas of the city. And it's about mobility, so making sure public transport spaces and places are safe. And that's had enormous long-term impact.
The large part of the problem, though, isn't it, Nicole, that this area of urban planning and design is still very much dominated by men. How are we going to change it? Is it simply about just waiting for more women to enter the field, or how do we, in fact, make sure that everybody understands the need to change what we do?
So my thinking is that it's not just enough to put women into those elevated leadership positions. Of course we want that, but we actually have to understand that we're designing for women as well. So it's not just about the profession, it's also about including the everyday lived experiences of women in the processes of design. And so what we do is we actually bring women and girls into contact with architects and urban planners to really help them to think about what it is like to be, for example, a 15-year-old girl in a city, or indeed an 85-year-old woman in a city, because we need to understand those experiences. And that's a core part of what we're doing at the XYX Lab.